lonely rancher buried his child. Until a stranger claimed to be the real father, he buried his son with his own hands. But when a stranger rode up claiming to be the boy's real father, Thomas Whitmore discovered that some graves hold more than just bodies. They hold the lies we tell ourselves to survive. The sun had no mercy for broken men. Thomas Whitmore stood over the small grave, hat in weathered hands, watching shadows creep across the wooden cross he'd carved from oak. 3 months had passed since fever took Samuel, yet Thomas returned each dawn like clockwork, speaking to silence as if his boy might answer from beneath 6 feet of prairie dirt. "Morning, son," he whispered, voice rough as sandpaper. "Cattle are restless today. Think they smell rain coming." But there was no rain. Hadn't been for weeks. The sky stretched endless and blue above the Texas plains, beautiful as a lie and just as cruel. Drought had cracked the earth like broken promises, and Thomas's cattle grew thinner each day, ribs showing through their hides like the bars of a prison. He knelt beside the grave and placed a worn wooden horse next to the cross. The same toy Samuel had clutched during those final fevered nights when death came calling with its quiet footsteps. Clara had carved that horse before the boy was born, her delicate fingers shaping dreams from pine while she sang lullabies to the child growing inside her. Clara, gone 6 years now, taken by the same childbirth that brought Samuel into this harsh world. Sometimes Thomas wondered if she'd been the lucky one, spared the watching, the waiting, the slow dissolution of everything they'd built together. The ranch house sat empty behind him, its windows dark as dead eyes. Creditors had been sniffing around like coyotes, leaving notices tacked to his door with words that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. Numbers and dates that meant the end of everything, if Thomas couldn't find a way to pay what he owed. But numbers felt small compared to the weight of this hillside grave. "Your mama used to say the dead don't leave us," Thomas told the wooden cross. "Said they stay close, watching over the ones they love. You watching over your old man, Samuel?" Wind whispered through the prairie grass, bending it low like heads bowed in prayer. Thomas had built this grave site himself, choosing the highest hill on his property so Samuel could see the whole spread, rolling grassland dotted with mesquite trees, the creek bed that ran silver when rains came, the barn where they'd spent so many evenings together. The boy had been born to this land, raised on horseback and morning chores. Thomas remembered teaching him to rope calves, watching those small hands struggle with the leather until muscle memory took hold. Samuel never complained, never asked for easier work, just followed his father through dust and heat, learning the rhythm of ranch life like other children learned their letters. Now the cattle wandered without purpose, and Thomas worked alone. He'd grown careless these past months, forgetting to check fence lines, letting weeds choke the water troughs. What was the point? Samuel wouldn't inherit this land now, wouldn't carry on the Whitmore name, or teach his own sons to read the weather in cloud formations and cow behavior. The dreams Thomas had carried, of expansion, of building something lasting, all of it had died with the boy. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with patient grace. Thomas watched it hunt, admiring the simple clarity of its purpose. Find food, survive another day. No complications, no grief to carry like stones in your chest. "Reckon I should sell," he told Samuel's grave. "Take what little I can get and head somewhere new. Start over. Maybe find work on another man's ranch." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew he'd never leave. Not while Samuel lay sleeping in this sacred ground. The boy had been born here, had taken his first steps in the dirt yard between house and barn. This was holy ground now, sanctified by love and loss. Thomas pulled weeds from around the wooden cross, his movements careful and reverent. He'd carved Samuel's name deep into the oak, along with the dates that bookend a life too brief, 1869 to 1875. 6 years of laughter and questions, of bedtime stories and morning prayers. 6 years that felt like both forever and not nearly long enough. The sun climbed higher, beating down on Thomas's bent shoulders as he tended the grave site. He'd promised Clara on her deathbed that he'd take care of their boy, and he'd kept that promise as best he could. Fed him, clothed him, taught him right from wrong, held him during thunderstorms, and celebrated his small victories. But in the end, love hadn't been enough to keep fever at bay. Thomas rose slowly, joints protesting the movement. Time to check on the cattle, to pretend the ranch still mattered. But first, he pressed his palm against the wooden cross, feeling the grain beneath his callous skin. "See you tomorrow, son." He was turning to leave when movement on the horizon caught his eye. A rider approached from the east, dust rising behind his horse like smoke from a distant fire. Visitors were rare out here, and Thomas felt a flicker of unease. Creditors didn't usually ride this far from town, but desperate times made men do desperate things. The stranger rode with purpose, his shadow falling long across the sacred ground where Thomas had built his shrine to loss. Something about the way he sat his horse, straight-backed and deliberate, suggested this wasn't a social call. Thomas settled his hat on his head and walked down the hill toward whatever news this stranger carried, leaving Samuel's grave to keep its silent watch over the dying land below. The stranger pulled out a locket Thomas thought he'd buried with his wife, and when it opened, everything Thomas believed about his son, about his life, shattered like glass in the dust. The rider dismounted slow, like a man carrying invisible weight. Thomas watched him approach, noting the deliberate way he moved, the careful set of his shoulders. This wasn't a creditor or a drifter looking for work. This man rode with ghosts, and Thomas recognized the look. He saw it in his own mirror every morning. "Thomas Whitmore." The stranger's voice carried the rasp of too many campfires, too many nights under open sky. "That's right." Thomas kept his hands easy at his sides, but his eyes never left the man's face. "You got business with me?" The stranger removed his hat, revealing hair gone gray at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. "Name's Marcus Dalton." I knew your wife." The words hit Thomas like cold water. "Clara's been dead 6 years." "I know." Marcus's voice broke on the words. "I came about the boy." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Samuel, my son." The silence that followed stretched between them like barbed wire. Thomas stared at this stranger, this Marcus Dalton, searching his weathered face for signs of madness or deception. But what he saw was worse than either. He saw truth, terrible and unwavering. "You're mistaken," Thomas said finally. "Samuel was my boy, born to me and Clara in this house." Marcus reached into his coat pocket, movements slow and careful as a man approaching a spooked horse. "I got something to show you." The locket caught the afternoon sun, gold chain glinting as it swayed from Marcus's fingers. Thomas felt his breath catch. He knew that locket, had searched everywhere for it after Clara died, turning their bedroom upside down trying to find it. "Where did you get that?" "She gave it to me," Marcus said quietly, "before she married you." Thomas wanted to call him a liar, wanted to drive him from the ranch with threats and fury. But his hands shook as he reached for the locket, and when it opened, the world cracked in half. Clara smiled up at him from the tiny photograph, young and radiant in a way Thomas had never seen her. She stood beneath an oak tree he didn't recognize, her hand resting on the arm of the man who now faced him across 6 years of lies. She was 18, Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. "We met at a church social in San Antonio. I was working cattle drives then, gone months at a time. Promised I'd come back for her." Thomas stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this laughing girl with the woman he'd married. Quiet Clara, who flinched when he touched her unexpectedly, who sang lullabies to Samuel in Spanish words she claimed her mother taught her. "She never told me about you." "Course not." Marcus's smile held no warmth. "Pregnant woman needed a husband. You were a good man with land and prospects. I was a drifter with nothing but promises." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Clara's insistence on a quick wedding, the way she'd counted months on her fingers when Samuel was born, her relief when the boy arrived small but healthy. The careful distance she'd maintained those first years of marriage, like a woman protecting secrets. You don't know for certain, Thomas said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Marcus nodded toward the grave on the hill. Boy favored his left hand, didn't he? Had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on his shoulder blade. Thomas's knees nearly buckled. How could you know that? Because I got the same mark. Marcus rolled up his sleeve, revealing the telltale crescent. And because I've been looking for him for 3 years. They walked to the house in silence heavy as storm clouds. Thomas's mind reeled with questions, accusations, desperate hope that this was all some elaborate lie. But the evidence mounted with each detail Marcus shared. Samuel's way of humming while he worked, his fear of thunderstorms, his habit of sleeping curled on his left side. "Why now?" Thomas asked as they reached the porch. "Why come here after all this time?" Marcus sat heavily on the wooden steps, half-balanced on his knees. "Been trying to get my life together. Saved some money, bought a small spread down near Austin. Thought maybe," his voice caught, "thought maybe I could finally be a father to him. He's dead." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Marcus closed his eyes, and Thomas watched this stranger, this father, absorb the blow that had already hollowed Thomas out months ago. "Fever," Thomas continued, surprised by his own gentleness. "Lasted 4 days. Nothing I could do." Marcus bent forward, elbows on knees, face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook with the kind of grief that comes from dreams dying all at once. Thomas found himself remembering those first terrible days after Samuel's death, when breathing felt like drowning and each sunrise seemed like a personal insult. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered. "I'm so damn sorry." They sat together as shadows lengthened across the yard, 2 broken men bound by a boy who belonged, perhaps, to neither and both. Thomas pulled out his bottle of whiskey, the one he'd been nursing since the funeral, and poured 2 glasses with hands that barely trembled. "Tell me about her," he said. "Tell me about Clara before she was my wife." Marcus raised his glass to the dying light, and in his weathered face, Thomas glimpsed the young man Clara had loved enough to remember with a locket pressed against her heart. The truth sat between them now, patient as death and twice as permanent. 2 fathers stood over one grave, each carrying 6 years of different pain. And Thomas realized that loving a child and creating one weren't always the same thing. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the truth. Thomas stared into his glass, watching amber liquid catch the last rays of sunlight. Beside him on the porch steps, Marcus sat silent as stone, both men wrestling with ghosts that had suddenly taken flesh. "She told me her parents died in a fire," Thomas said finally. "Said that's why she had no family at the wedding." Marcus shook his head. "Her folks are still alive, far as I know. Live in a little house outside San Antonio, grow corn, and raise chickens." He took a long drink, probably still wondering what happened to their daughter. Each revelation was a knife twist. Thomas had built his marriage on Clara's stories, her dead parents, her lonely childhood, her gratitude for his protection. Now those stories crumbled like old paper, leaving him to wonder what else had been lies. "Did she love you?" The question escaped before Thomas could stop it. Marcus's laugh held no humor. "Thought she did. Maybe she thought so too." He rolled the glass between his palms. "But love don't always survive when a woman's got a child coming and no husband to claim it. She loved Samuel." Thomas's voice carried desperate certainty. Whatever else was lies, that was true. Never doubted that. Marcus looked toward the hill where the wooden cross caught the last light. "Takes a special kind of woman to love a child enough to marry a stranger for his sake." The words stung because they carried truth. Thomas remembered Clara's careful affection those first years, how she'd seemed to study his face for signs of kindness or cruelty. She'd been protecting more than just herself. She'd been protecting Samuel from a world that had no patience for bastard children. "You got any proof?" Thomas asked. "Besides marks and habits." Marcus reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a wooden whistle, carved with delicate precision and worn smooth by handling. "Made this when I got word she was carrying," Marcus said. "Spent 3 months getting it perfect, thinking about teaching him bird calls, maybe hunting songs. His voice roughened. Never got the chance to give it to him. Thomas took the whistle, feeling its weight in his palm. The craftsmanship was beautiful, better than anything he could have managed with his rough rancher's hands. This was made by someone who understood fine work, who cared enough to carve dreams into wood. Clara used to hum sometimes, Thomas said slowly. Spanish songs, she claimed. But now that I think on it, he lifted the whistle to his lips and blew a soft, haunting note. This melody. Samuel knew it too. Marcus closed his eyes. My grandmother's lullaby. Taught it to Clara during one of our long talks by the creek. The pieces fell into place with terrible precision. Every mystery about Clara, her knowledge of songs Thomas didn't recognize, her careful way of speaking about the past, her fierce protectiveness of Samuel, all of it made sense now. She was scared, Thomas realized. All those years, she was scared I'd figure it out, or that I'd come back. Marcus stood, pacing to the porch rail. Maybe both. Anger rose in Thomas's chest, hot and sudden as a prairie fire. You should have stayed away. Should have let sleeping dogs lie. You think I wanted this? Marcus spun around, his own fury finally breaking free. You think I wanted to find out my boy was dead? That I missed 6 years of his life because his mother was too ashamed to tell the truth. She did what she had to do. For who? For him? Or for herself? The question hung between them like smoke. Thomas wanted to defend Clara, to protect her memory from this stranger's judgment. But doubt had taken root in his heart, growing like weeds through the foundation of everything he believed. They walked to Samuel's grave as full darkness fell, carrying the weight of their argument up the hill. The wooden cross stood sentinel against the sky full of stars, and Thomas felt the familiar ache in his chest, the hollow place where his son's laughter used to live. Marcus knelt beside the grave and placed the wooden whistle next to the toy horse Thomas had left that morning. 2 fathers, 2 tokens of love. The sight of them together, one offered by memory, one by regret, made Thomas's throat tight. I changed his diapers, Thomas said quietly. Walked the floor with him when he had colic. Taught him to ride, to rope, to pray. And I missed all of it. Marcus's voice broke. Because I was chasing cattle across Texas, thinking I had all the time in the world to come back and claim what was mine. He wasn't yours to claim. The words came out harsher than Thomas intended. Blood don't make you a father. Being there does. Loving them does. Marcus looked up at him, tears tracking through the dust on his weathered cheeks. Then what does that make me? Thomas stared down at this broken man, this stranger who carried Samuel's blood and his grandmother's lullabies. In Marcus's grief, Thomas recognized his own, the particular anguish of a father who couldn't protect his child from the world's cruelties. I don't know, Thomas said finally. Maybe we're both fathers. Maybe neither of us are. They sat beside the grave as the night deepened around them, 2 men bound by loss and the terrible mathematics of love. The whistle and the wooden horse lay together in the starlight, mute testimony to the complicated legacy of one small boy who had belonged, perhaps, to everyone and no one. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new pain to sort through. But tonight, in the sacred silence of Samuel's resting place, Thomas began to understand that some truths were too big for one man's heart to hold alone. When 2 broken fathers made a pact over their son's grave, they discovered that the strongest bonds aren't forged by blood. They're built by the choice to carry another man's grief as your own. Dawn came gray and quiet, painting the world in shades of forgiveness. Thomas woke on the porch where he'd fallen asleep beside Marcus, both men too drunk on whiskey and sorrow to make it inside. His neck ached from sleeping against the wooden rail, but the pain felt clean compared to the hollowness that had lived in his chest these past months. Marcus stirred beside him, blinking in the pale light. For a moment, neither man spoke. The events of yesterday hung between them like morning mist, fragile, shifting, but undeniably real. We got a choice to make, Thomas said finally. Marcus sat up slowly, working a crick from his shoulder. Reckon we do. They walked to Samuel's grave in silence, boots crunching through frost-brittle grass. The wooden whistle and toy horse lay where they'd left them, dark with dew, but somehow sacred in the morning light. Thomas knelt and touched the carved cross, feeling its familiar grain beneath his fingers. "Could dig him up," he said quietly. "Have a doctor look at his bones, settle this thing once and for all." Marcus recoiled as if struck. "Jesus, Thomas, you want to disturb the boy's rest for what? To prove which one of us has the right to grieve. Might be the only way to know the truth." "Truth?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Truth is that boy lived 6 years, loved and cared for. Truth is he's gone now, and all our fighting won't bring him back." Thomas studied the other man's face, seeing his own exhaustion reflected there. "Then what do you want to do?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cross that marked Samuel's resting place. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision. "Want to build him a better marker. Something that'll last longer than pine wood and good intentions." They rode to town that morning, 2 men with a shared purpose. Thomas had expected awkwardness, the brittle politeness of strangers forced together by circumstance. Instead, he found himself talking easily with Marcus about the weather, the cattle, the way the land looked different after drought. At the stonemason's shop, they designed a proper headstone together. Gray granite carved with Samuel's name and dates, and below that, words they chose with careful deliberation. "Beloved son, raised by Thomas, born of Marcus, claimed by both." "That'll raise eyebrows," the mason warned, chisel poised over stone. "Let it," Thomas said. While they waited for the headstone to be finished, Marcus proved himself useful around the ranch. He had a way with horses that impressed Thomas, and his rope work was smooth as silk. They labored together in comfortable silence, mending fences the drought had made brittle, checking cattle that had grown too familiar with hunger. "You planning to stay?" Thomas asked one evening as they shared supper on the porch. Marcus considered the question while he chewed salt pork and beans. "Got nowhere else pressing to be. Could help you get this place back on its feet, if you'll have me." Mike could use the help. It wasn't poetry, but it was enough. Winter came early that year, bringing the first real rain in months. Thomas and Marcus worked side by side to save what cattle they could, driving them to higher ground when the creek flooded, sharing night watches when coyotes grew bold. They spoke of Samuel often during those long hours. Thomas shared stories of bedtime prayers and morning chores, of teaching the boy to read by lamplight and watching him take his first steps between the house and barn. Marcus contributed dreams of what might have been, fishing trips and hunting lessons, the whistle songs he'd planned to teach. Together, their memories painted a fuller picture of the boy than either could have managed alone. When the granite headstone arrived, they installed it on the first clear day after the rains. The stone sat solid and permanent on the little hill, its carved words catching sunlight like promises kept. Thomas ran his fingers over Samuel's name, carved deep enough to last generations. "Think we did right by him. Think we're doing the best we know how." Spring brought new grass and the return of hope. Thomas's cattle began to put on weight, and the creditors agreed to extended terms now that Marcus's savings had helped settle the worst debts. They planted a garden behind the house, tomatoes and corn, beans and squash, working the soil with hands that had learned to labor together. "Clara would have liked this," Thomas said one evening, watching Marcus tend the bean rows with careful precision. "Reckon she would." Marcus straightened, dirt dark under his fingernails. Always did love growing things. They established routines that felt natural as breathing. Morning visits to Samuel's grave, where they'd share coffee and speak to the stone as if the boy might answer. Days spent working cattle or mending equipment, comfortable in their shared silence. Evenings on the porch, where they planned tomorrow's work or simply watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of ending. Thomas learned that Marcus had fought in the war, losing 2 brothers at Shiloh. Marcus discovered that Thomas had wanted more children, but Clara's fear of childbirth had made her pull away from intimacy. They were both men carved by loss, shaped by the weight of caring too much in a world that seemed designed to break hearts. On Christmas morning, They found a red-tailed hawk perched on Samuel's headstone, its fierce eyes surveying the ranch spread below. Neither man spoke as they watched the bird hunt, riding wind currents with ancient patience. When it finally flew away, Thomas felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. "Think that was a sign?" Marcus asked. "Maybe. Or maybe it was just a hawk looking for breakfast." They walked back to the house together, two fathers bound by loss and choice, ready to face whatever the new year might bring to the land they decided to call home. Behind them, Samuel's stone stood guardian over rolling grassland, its carved words holding fast. Family wasn't always born of blood. Sometimes it was forged by the grace men showed each other in the midst of their deepest pain.